Howdy, this is Jim Rutt, and this is The Jim Rutt Show. Listeners have asked us to provide pointers to some of the resources we talk about on the show. We now have links to books and articles referenced in recent podcasts that are available on our website. We also offer full transcripts. Go to jimruttshow.com. That's jimruttshow.com. Today's guest is David Shapiro. David is a longtime techie and AI guy. In fact, he's been studying and fine-tuning LLMs since GPT-2. Damn, yeah, he old dude in this stuff. It's hilarious how being an OG means like 4 years, right? Something like that. These days, he's a thinker, a writer, and a video maker on topics around the impact of IT and AI to our future. Welcome back, David.
Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, he recently appeared on our show in EP 317, where we talked about post-labor economics, which is David's term for what happens when machines replace most human labor. A very interesting and well-received episode, so check it out if you haven't already. I came upon David in Twitterland. He kept posting these things. I go, God damn, this is an interesting guy. So I reached out to him. And one of the things that he wrote about was how he used LLMs in his work in developing his post-labor economics, presumably, which we'll find out more here in a few minutes, in both researching and probably in the writing that he did. And I know I was interested in the topic, and I assume a lot of other people are as well. So I invited David to come back quickly to not focus on the substance of his ideas, but focus on how he used LLMs to do the work, basically. So David.
Yeah, no, thanks for the introduction. Long story short, there's every time technology generates a new tool, academia has a, existential crisis when Wikipedia came out, word processors, and I'm barely old enough that I remember using a card catalog in the library. But fundamentally, these tools are just tools. I married a librarian and she did her master's thesis on GPT-3. When you look at these tools and you study them and you say, okay, what is it actually good for? And you kind of test it to failure and you watch the progression from GPT-2 to GPT-3 to ChatGPT, and now we're on GPT-5. They get better and better. And like any tool, it is a matter of skill and having the correct mental model. We were talking just before we hit record that, you can hurt yourself pretty bad with a drill or a chainsaw, or you can make really good output with those things. And one of the things that I want to kind of emphasize is that when I do this work, and we can get into the details of my process, when I do this work, I'm not just saying like asking ChatGPT, solve this problem for me, and then I copy paste the output. There's many, many more steps. And I approach research the same that anyone else would approach research. It's just with another layer of tooling on top of it. So my tool stack is a combination of ChatGPT, deep research, Google's NotebookLM, and sometimes Grok and Perplexity, although I will say Grok is a little more of a loose cannon when it comes to epistemic rigor, despite Elon Musk's claims about being maximally truth-seeking. But that's the basic stack, and we can dive into whichever layer you want to go to from there.
I reinforce what you say, because I'm also in a mode for the first time in a number of years doing truly primary intellectual work, research intensive. And I use a whole flight of tools. I use the high-end ChatGPT Pro. I use Anthropic. I use them to check each other. When I get a chunk of ideas or text from one, I'll check it with the other. Once I have a working document, I'll ask the other engine, would this change be an improvement in this document? And so using a number of tools is important, but also to reinforce your point, you don't say, write me a paper about X and then press go, right? And oh, by the way, it will do it, but it'll suck a big one, right? It'll be terrible. I mean, totally useless, worse than useless. It'll just be garbage. And so what is the tool actually good for? is hugely important to your point about chainsaws and drills, right? You're not going to use a chainsaw to be able to install a hanger to put up a picture in your house. Well, you might use a drill for that, and probably won't use a drill to try to take down a tree. But chainsaw would be good for that.
There you go.
And so thinking clearly about your tools and their limits is critical. I live on a farm. I have to deal with all kinds of crazy stuff on the ground. And even if I have a chainsaw, if I have a 36-inch white oak down and I only have my 14-inch light chainsaw with me, guess what? Don't do that, right? Don't use Perplexity to write a paper on the science of emergence, right? You better go back and get your 24-inch chainsaw. And even then, it's pretty tricky to cut a 36-inch white oak log with a 24-inch chainsaw, though it can be done. So, and then to make all this more difficult, tools, tasks, limits, what they're good for. These tools are changing every day, right? And sometimes for the worst on Tuesday, and then it's better again on Thursday. And in major ways, they're changing every few weeks. You can just feel them getting better and stronger, and not just the official releases. They're screwing with this shit constantly, especially the wrappers around them. So very, very, very important to think about these, in fact, multiple of them, as tools in a toolbox, and think what they're good for. So now let's get back to your project. So first, maybe just very quickly reiterate what post-labor economics was, and then start telling us how you used your tools.
Elevator pitch for post-labor economics is what we're witnessing is the decoupling of economic growth and activity from human labor inputs. It's been happening for decades, and it's only accelerating with the help of AI. And that's part of what we're going to be talking about today is how much labor did we save ourselves by using these tools for research. Another dimension is that I've actually used these same research tools quite extensively for my health. I had some long-term complications from COVID, and I had not made any progress for a couple of years until I got access to these tools. In terms of thinking about them as like tools, kind of one of the places where I start whenever I'm teaching anyone or explaining it to someone is the first thing that they're good for is just learning, just exploring a space where you say, hey, I don't know about topic X, teach me until you get to a point of saturation, or you explore that blue ocean mentality. You say, oh, what does this mean? What does that mean? And it's just an endless stream of questions until you wrap your head around a domain. And of course, you don't know what you don't know. You have the kind of search bubble problem still with AI. For anyone who might not remember, the search bubble problem is Google will only give you answers to questions that you ask. And if you're not smart enough to ask the right questions, or if you don't have enough knowledge of the domain to even ask the right questions, you're kind of hemmed in by default just from your own blind spots. AI offers a new way forward where you can just say, I want to learn about X. Tell me everything that I need to know. What's the first 5 lessons? You start there, and that is where it can kind of take the role of a master learning series. So mastery learning is a education theory where you basically have a tutor and a student. And it can take that role. And in fact, that has been baked into many AIs now, where they have a learning mode. I prefer not to use the learning modes. I just kind of do everything self-directed. But that's the first thing that they can do. And then the second thing is brainstorming. You say, okay, as you start to wrap your head around a topic or a domain, you can say, hey, what about this? Is my intuition correct? And that constant back and forth of testing your intuition. I mean, that's what pop quizzes are, right? That's what a quiz is. That's what a test is measuring how well you can actually synthesize within that domain. And so then, your whatever level of error you get, the AI will be able to fact check your understanding, provide some pushback, and they've only gotten better at this as well. So taking a step back, what you're doing is you're not relying on the AI. So there's been a few reports out there saying, oh, people who rely on AI, they have cognitive degeneration. Well, when you look closer at those studies, it was college students who were just told, write an essay as fast as possible on topic X. So of course they did it as lazily as possible. But if you use it as a learning companion that can actually stress test your understanding, you will learn more about that topic. It's not much different than going to the library and coming back with a stack of books and reading until you get to the point where you see the same facts and figures and concepts over and over again. The difference is it can meet you where you're at any given time. So that's kind of what I would say is step one of using these AI tools, which is probably not as sexy and not as, oh, it's just gonna, you just give it your problem and it goes off and solves it. That's kind of the promise. And absolutely there are situations where you say, where I've had major insights and major breakthroughs where I just sit down, I feel like I'm on writer's block or just mentally blocked, and I just lay everything out, spill my guts to the AI, say, I'm stuck on this. I don't know what the next step is. Can you figure out what I'm missing or what the next idea is? More often than not, those kinds of conversations are not necessarily helpful. The AI doesn't give you the answer, but it can give you the direction to go in, where it says, did you think about this angle? Or you see some little clue that helps you explore that search space a little bit faster and gives you a little bit better of a compass. So that's kind of the high level conceptual theoretical aspect of using these tools for frontier research.
Yeah, let's talk about the first, then we'll move along. This idea of exploring a domain is huge. And I would say in my work, it's probably the biggest speed up, though maybe not the most important. It's the biggest time saver. Because when you're exploring an area that you only sort of know, and you don't know the history of the field, you don't know what other people have said, and you can look at Wikipedia, but that's not really a deep way to understand it. One of the things I'm doing a lot of, I find, is finding PDF versions of classic books or classic papers and asking. For books, I always use Gemini Pro 2.5. It's amazing at summarizing books. It's the only model I found that seems to be able to understand the book all the way through from the beginning to the end. The other models tend to be better at the beginning or the end, or sometimes the beginning and the end, and not as good in the middle. So find the PDF version of a classic book, give it to Gemini Pro, and say something like this: give me a detailed multi-level outline of this book. And for each outline point and subpoint, give me a detailed summary of the content. Most of the time, it does a great job. Once in a while, it doesn't go deep enough. You have to go one level deeper, please, and then it'll do it again. And you can, it'll take, 5 minutes to do it. And then it might take 45 minutes to carefully read it and think about it. But you basically absorbed a classic book of the literature in 45 minutes. And further, in some ways you've missed some nuance. And in some ways, of course, the LLMs may have made a small error. But the amount of content that you have added to your brain per unit of time is utterly staggering. I don't think I could do the work I'm currently doing in numerous domains without this tool. But I am a little bit concerned about the following, and it's not, the cognitive hijacking. It's actually quite the opposite, which is I am now absorbing deep and powerful ideas at an unprecedented rate. And because I read a lot of books, listeners' podcasts know I probably read 75 books a year. I've been doing that for more than 50 years. So I got a lot of stuff in my head. I read, probably tens of thousands of scientific papers and God knows what all else. But this is at a new level of fire hose of powerful information coming into my head. And so, go to the scientific paper example. Say I have a 9-page scientific paper to read in its scientific paper form. Those users who haven't read scientific papers, a lot of them are very dense, very mathematical. And in fact, I'm convinced the damn scientists write in an impenetrable fashion, mostly to impress each other about how smart they are. Though frankly, I think that a paper that's very readable is what really shows you how smart you are. That's what Richard Feynman said. If you can't teach it to a 5th grader, you probably don't understand it. But anyway, it can take you quite a while to work your way through a 9-page scientific paper. But the detailed summary that comes from an LLM, you can read that in, few minutes. And so anyway, back around to my comment. I wonder what it's doing to our brains to have so many strong, well-defined ideas stuffed into our heads so rapidly. Are they fighting with each other for attention in a way that makes it a little harder for us to think? I haven't yet seen it so far, but I think it's a possibility.
I mean, on the topic of cognition or intelligence, what percolates up in my mind when you're talking about this is what E.O. Wilson actually called consilience, which is we all live in the same physical world, and there's different disciplines and different domains. But the fact that we live in a shared reality means that there must be some underlying commonalities between all of these different domains, whether it's genetics or society or economics or whatever else. I think that particularly when you your brain will automatically do a lot of that just when you read broadly, right? If you're more of a polymath. But with AI, one of the structural differences when you're using these tools that to me is that you can follow your interest. And so what happens is as soon as you have a question, the time between your brain generating the signal of, hey, what does this mean? And getting the answer and slotting that piece in, it's like doing a jigsaw puzzle, but you have an X-ray vision where you know exactly where the next piece is. So you're assembling the puzzle of epistemics, whatever breadth you want, you're assembling it much faster. Now, what I will say is that it can be tempting and it can be easy to gloss over some of the details. And that's why I emphasize stress testing your understanding as you go. Or at least that's what I do, where I'm like, okay, every now and then I'll just start a new chat or a new project and I'll just say, okay, this is what is on my mind today. Because as I'm sure that you've noticed and anyone else who uses these tools, because there is a variance in the way that each different AI reacts, but also the way it reacts from chat to chat, from instance to instance will also vary. And so you'll learn, okay, did I distill this idea correctly in a way that it is portable to every other AI that's out there, or is it repeatable across chats? And of course, repetition is a big component of any kind of learning. There are certainly pitfalls to avoid, but again, it's no different from any other form of studying. A lot of it comes down to repetition and synthesis and to a certain extent regurgitation.
And also the expansion part. As you mentioned this, I do this all the time now when I'm reading a paper or a book and I see something I vaguely know, right? I'll basically quickly get out my phone usually and type into one of the models and ask them the question and then go about my reading. And then, 10 minutes later, I'll come back 20 minutes later and read this thing, and this thing that in my brain would have been a little fuzzy spot now becomes a much more intense spotlight on that little piece. And this is where your tool selection is important. If it's just a real simple question, Perplexity does a great job, way better than Google. Perplexity Research, next level of depth. Today, GPT-5 is fast and pretty good for next level questions. Put it on 5 Pro Deep Research, let it come back in half an hour, and you'll have a master's degree level of knowledge on the topic. And so depending on how far you think you want to go, you choose your tooling accordingly.
So one of the tools that I mentioned earlier on is NotebookLM. So that's a Google tool. And what a lot of these tools allow you to do now, OpenAI did the first one, the first deep research, it was kind of the first agentic, like mass-produced agentic tool where you give it a research query and it'll go and search the entire internet far and wide, pulling, dozens of sources. But it's not just pulling sources. It can also do work on those sources. It can, compare and contrast and do some synthesis and coding and data crunching and that sort of thing. But what OpenAI's deep research introduced was the ability to export the result to PDF. Google Gemini deep research now allows you to export the results to Google Docs, which then you can save it to PDF or Word doc, whatever you want. And the reason I bring this up is because having a trace of everything that you think that you're learning is phenomenal. And so what I started doing is I started keeping corpuses. I started building knowledge bases for every particular topic that I was working on, whether it was, long COVID and chronic fatigue or post-labor economics or all the many, many subcomponents of post-labor economics. And eventually, I think as of right now, I've got almost 90 PDFs saved that were constructed, basically custom research reports that you would have a postdoc do for you or a research intern do for you that I had the AI do for me. So I have something like 1,500 to 2,000 pages of bespoke research to go into post-labor economics. Now, of course, that's north of, 1.5 million words. No one's going to read all that. So I need to distill the work down. But uploading all of that to NotebookLM, because that's really what NotebookLM does for anyone who hasn't used it, is you upload an arbitrary number of documents, and it uses a combination of AI tools. It uses what's called RAG, or Retrieval Augmented Generation. So it chops up every document that you upload to it. It indexes it, so you have your own privatized Google, but it's not just Google. It's using AI augmented search, and you can chat with your research corpus. And they've even added a couple new features where you can have it automatically generate a podcast. So it'll simulate a podcast of two people talking about the research. And now there's an even newer feature where it'll allow you to generate a video. So it'll give you a little 8-minute YouTube video kind of introducing the topic. It also will generate knowledge graphs. So a little tree-shaped knowledge graph of all the topics and subtopics, which allows you to explore the data. So the first phase is exploration. The second phase is expansion. And then at this point, once you've kind of realized you've gotten to the edges of the research domain, there's only so much information that's out there that has already been done. It's the equivalent of a AI augmented literature review. Then it's time to really kind of, get the pedal to the metal, let the rubber meet the road, and you pull out all those facts and topics, and you go, this is what I've done, is I go over it again and again and again, and then I start teaching it. Because one of the best ways to distill knowledge is you communicate it. And that's how things have really kind of come down for me with post-labor economics and researching chronic health issues as well, is you start communicating it. Because when you have the huge mass of knowledge in your head, it hasn't necessarily been refined. It's not polished. But the polish is actually one of the most important components. As you mentioned just a little while ago, if you can't communicate something clearly and simply, you probably don't understand it well enough. By the way, that quotation is often misattributed to Einstein. He wrote a letter to a friend. He said, basically you should be able to explain it to your grandmother. It wasn't quite so simple, but then that was conflated with Richard Feynman's quotation about you should be able to explain it simply. That's kind of the next step of epistemic refinement or subject matter expertise. There we go. Or mastery. And those tools, again, you have to use them correctly, and you do have to use them. I will also add just one last footnote, is there is no supplement or there is no replacement for the hard work of actually, talking to other humans, other experts. If you have an audience like I do with YouTube, I just make a video or write a blog kind of explaining what I think. And the internet is always happy to poke holes in your thoughts and ideas. The quality of feedback is hit or miss at times, but you get that feedback. And then talking to other humans and other real experts to make sure that you understand what you think that you understand. There's a phenomenon going around the internet that's called AI psychosis, but basically where people spend all of their time only talking with AI and not other humans, and they kind of go down a black hole of their own echo chamber. We can unpack that if you'd like as well.
We'll talk about that maybe in a little bit, but the iterative improvement is something that I also find these things, as you mentioned, just crazy. Like you get a rough draft that's sort of okay, but it's not, the organization isn't right. So you say, all right, reorganize this thing so it's rhetorically stronger. At least I'm a sufficiently poor writer. I'm a great talker, but I'm not that good a writer. And so it really helps me do things like that. And then I'll go through paragraph by paragraph or section by section and ask questions like, is this section fully in congruence with the rest of the paper? And if not, please give some detailed recommendations for improvement. And now again, as we talked about tools, it'll spew out a bunch of improvements. Some of them, though, aren't necessarily good. It may go into too much detail, or it may actually just make a mistake. And so you have to vet what it says, but then you say, all right, apply this, and this proposed change. And it's amazing how quickly you can ratchet up the quality of a chunk of writing by using that iterative, essentially critic in the loop approach.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I've used it quite extensively for drafting copy. And one of the rules of thumb that I have found is that any chatbot can write about 10 solid paragraphs at a time. They can often write more, but they start to repeat themselves or they kind of peter out and kind of get lazy and sloppy. So what I have done is as I'm creating outlines and drafting and redrafting and revising any of the output that I use AI for drafting, what I do is I'll have it say, okay, this section needs to achieve X, Y, and Z. The reader needs to come away with this belief, and they need to learn these facts. This is the point. Write me 10 to 15 paragraphs that achieve that. And so I keep it all kind of separated in my manuscript, in my documents. And I do the same thing. Interestingly, Google Docs and Microsoft Word with Copilot enabled allow you to just highlight a paragraph now, and you just say, make this paragraph better. These tools are not that good at that particular task yet. You have to be very explicit about how you want it to reword something. But when with my approach, that kind of more atomized approach where I've got it broken down into sections and subsections and sometimes sub-subsections, depending on how big the manuscript is, just keeping it in those chunks, because then you can say, okay, what is the purpose of this subtopic? And make sure that that wad of text achieves that. Now, one thing that I found that's interesting is because I've spent a lot of time writing before getting these tools, and I was a decent enough writer before this. But when I say, this is who this audience is for, make sure it is dense but accessible, make sure that it you cite sources and include facts and figures, it communicates better than I can verbally, or written rather. I spend a lot of time talking too in front of the camera. And what I've noticed, particularly as my work has been disseminated and read by more people, sometimes it's like there's just no flourish is required, but there's the level of thoroughness, especially when you instruct the tools to be thorough, to be comprehensive and clear. And it's just, okay, cool. Here you go, boss. I will follow your instructions to the letter, but you have to give it good instructions. Again, it's still a tool. I'm reminded of another mantra: a shitty gun in the hands of an expert shooter is better than a fantastic weapon in the hands of a shitty shooter, right? Same principle applies here. It's if you understand communication and rhetoric and what you're trying to achieve, the tool will be much better than if you just say, figure it out for me. Many of us on the internet spaces, we talk about how it's often a skill issue. If someone says, oh, well, the AI can't do X, Y, and Z, it's like, well, it works just fine for me, so it must be a user issue. In technology, we say PEBCAC, problem exists between keyboard and chair. So it's like not the technology.
Yeah, that's critical, because the reports you hear, people having problems with AI is often again, back to what we originally studied, they don't understand the tool and the imprecisions of the tool. And to your point also, that it'll go on, they like to bloviate, right? A lot of the models do. And so if you give them a prompt that encourages them to go too far, they will. And it's your job to then rein them back in and say, wait a minute, try that again. But instead of, 12 twisted paragraphs, write 6 clear ones, for instance, right? And they can do it a lot faster than I can tell you that. But again, you then have to read the 6 paragraphs to make sure they didn't make a mistake, and they will occasionally. It is very, very interesting. Let's go back to NotebookLM. Yeah, I know a number of people have told me how cool it is, and I tried to use it on a small project, and I think I just didn't spend enough time to master it. Talk about kind of the gestalt of what NotebookLM gives you. Why do you find it a powerful tool in your workflow?
Yeah, so speaking of tools and limitations, it is one of the narrower purpose tools. From my perspective, one of the key uses of NotebookLM is just, I've got a giant corpus of text that I don't want to go searching through it every time. So when for instance, as I'm doing my research, I say, I have 80 plus PDFs uploaded to my post-labor economics NotebookLM task, and I say, give me every example of a community-based intervention or a community-based measurement. And it says, cool, boss, here you go. And I tell it the format that I want. I say, make sure that it's got the who sponsored it, how big it is, how successful it was. Give me a paragraph describing this intervention or this measurement. What is the impact of it? And it's able to go through, and it takes a couple minutes. It reads all of my sources, and then it'll give me a one long output that just says, here you go. Here is basically an appendix grade blurb that says, here's everything that you go. So that's one example of the use cases of just saying, extract something particular from my corpus of research that I've got here. I think it's the way that Google has prompted the language model is it will not synthesize. It will not add anything. It'll stay within the 4 corners of the documents that you have uploaded. So that's actually one of the major limitations. If you ask it to say, okay, look at all these sources and come up with a new idea, it literally sometimes will tell you, I'm kind of not allowed to do that. I'm only here as your personal reference librarian. So it can become an expert on the sources that you have, but if you're missing a source, it won't help you. It just says, we don't have that in the library, sorry. So that's one of the main limitations of that tool.
Yeah, so it doesn't have the deep research capability that some of the other tools have.
Correct. But that can be good. If you don't want it to be poisoned or contaminated by other ideas, you say, I'm controlling the corpus of knowledge here, stick within these boundaries. But that can actually be really good, because if you start asking it questions and it says, 404 not found, then that can be a clue that you need to go add some sources to your research database.
Interesting. I have to get my head back around that and realize and say it's the librarian of my stack. It's not really integrated with the broader tool chain. There's an opportunity there for Google to do something interesting, which is to, allow you to toggle, kind of like in Cursor, where you can go between agent mode and whatever the hell the other mode's called, and say, don't pay attention to the wider world, or go out or pay attention to the wider world with respect to this query. That would be easy for Google to do, you would think. Well, maybe they'll do it. You also mentioned something, again, I just tried to do it the other day, and maybe I didn't spend enough time on it. Trying to get Copilot to work with Word. I went and signed up for Copilot Pro on my Microsoft account, download the fresh version of Word, blah, blah. And it just seems to refuse to work. It just doesn't work at all. It certainly doesn't recognize the fact that I have a Pro subscription. When I type something in, it gives me some half-assed answer that, blah, blah. It just didn't work at all. Because the idea of using it to highlight a paragraph and work a paragraph, I think would be very nice. And I did ask Perplexity Research Mode what was better, Copilot in Word or the Google editor in Google Docs, and its opinion was the Copilot Pro. And so I wanted to try it, but doesn't seem to work. What the fuck, right? And I don't know, there's something really screwed up at the moment about that tooling. Are there any special tricks to get Copilot to work with Word?
For me, it self-installed, and it said, by the way, Copilot's installed, because I think it's tied to your Office 365 subscription or something.
That's what I added the Copilot Pro to my Office 365 subscription. So it ought to know, you idiot, right?
Right. Yeah. And I have noticed that particularly, so mentally, I kind of categorize those as the Copilot class, where it's baked into another app, whether it's Google Docs or Microsoft Office. I have found them to be pretty persnickety, where if you want it to rewrite a paragraph, you have to be very, very explicit. But it's interesting because sometimes if you're too explicit, it'll just regurgitate what you said. I think they use very cheap, lightweight models. And one of the problems with them is they often will ignore the rest of the document. So they'll confabulate a bunch of ideas in the one paragraph that you've written. But if you say, like, hey, for instance, if it's dialogue in a work of fiction, you say, make this dialogue a little more visceral. That kind of instruction it tends to be able to follow pretty well. But taking a step back, if it's really heavy duty work, scientific literature, and it's kind of, you're working on a passage in a larger body, often I find that it is better to just take that section and put it into a new thread, a new chat in your favorite chatbot, and say, we're working on this. Let's overhaul this one passage or this one chapter. And then you can kind of copy paste the results back. I will also say that Microsoft is Microsoft's worst enemy when it comes to UX and UI. So there's a reason that people don't use Bing. And their Copilot might go the same direction, where, basically businesses use it because it's the only option, but consumers choose not to use it for some of those similar reasons. Particularly when there are better tools out there, it's just not all baked in, right? Now, that's not to say that it won't improve in the future, but certainly right now there are UX limitations to both the Google Docs and the Microsoft Copilot version.
Once you start to get an idea put together, we talked about critic a little bit, using things as a critic and as a brainstorming tool. Why don't you go into that in a little bit more depth when you're wanting to explore, have I gone far enough? Am I in the context of what other people have said, et cetera? Talk about that aspect.
Yeah. So let me just tell you a brief story. Like with post-labor economics, I have been working on it for a few years, similar to some of the work that you've been doing. My work got turbocharged when the latest crop of AI models came out. And I said, okay, now I can afford to do this on my own. And so, there's the period of expansion of just, gathering more and more data, more and more information, training my own brain, important step, and then communicating it out. And I would ask it like, hey, generate an outline for this book. And it would kind of give you a generic outline. And I'm like, there's not really there's not a core thrust to this. There's not a clear thesis. And that's something that, at least until this point, I haven't been able to get AI to think in that kind of way, to really distill something down. And so that had to come down to just my own good old fashioned brain power, and also conversations with humans, because one thing that happens is there'll be sparks that happen when you're communicating with another human. Sometimes it's just my wife. I'm just saying, hey, I am really excited. I just figured this thing out. And she'll ask a counterfactual question. Those inflection points, those little nexuses of understanding, that's really what to seize upon. I think this is where AI kind of still falls into that uncanny valley, because the way that it processes information is very different from humans. And it looks human-like in many respects. It can do some of the same kinds of reasoning, but still it's a different substrate. It's a different approach. And so when you say what really resonates, the thing that the AI really understands and really resonates with the AI is not what's going to really resonate with a human. That's just something that I have found time and time again. That's kind of at the critique level and the brainstorming level. One of the things that I do is every time I have a complete manuscript or a new version of a manuscript, I upload it to, several AIs now. Gemini has a huge context window, so it can understand the whole thing. Grok is okay, although I find that the quality of Grok, which is the one by XAI, continues to oscillate, let's say, wildly. And then ChatGPT and I use Claude a little bit less lately. But these models are all generally big enough that they can ingest an entire book, as long as it's not, the entire Tolkien trilogy. They can ingest a whole book at once. And then you say, what do you think of this? Because if you pretend like the work isn't yours, it changes its attitude dramatically. If you're saying, what do you think about this? Does this pass muster, or does it raise any eyebrows? And it'll say, oh yeah, this looks like a good treatise, or there's a few gaps. And to one of the things that you said earlier, sometimes it is like herding cats. When I gave it post-labor economics, one of those sessions, it said, oh well, you're missing everything from the developing world to climate change and blah blah blah. I'm like, this is not a totalizing theory of the entire human race. This is what do we do about labor? Anything that is not measuring or providing interventions is out of scope. And so it's like, okay, yeah, I see what you mean. And so that goes back to, specificity when you ask it for that feedback. If you say, like, the difference in wording is, what's wrong with this? It's going to look for problems. If you say, what do you think about this? It'll give you a different kind of response. If you say, those are kind of the two of the main prompts that I go to is, what do you think about this? What's wrong with this? Sometimes I ask for gaps, those kinds of things. And when it doesn't know that it's your work, it will tend to flatter you less. Because that goes back to the sycophancy problem that a lot of AIs have, where they'll treat the user like, thy God, the reader. For anyone who's a novelist, that's one of the mantras, which is the only audience that matters is the reader. And so you have to write to the reader, not necessarily what you want to write. But if you change it so that it looks like you're a skeptical person who wants help understanding this, paper or this book, it'll be a little bit more, let's say, diligent and honest with its critique and feedback. One way to approach it.
Yeah, exactly. I found the same thing, that if you just are, just say, hey, we're just chatting here, it'll butter you up a fair bit. Though I do notice that 5 is a little less obsequious and sycophantic than GPT-4 was. And Claude was never as bad as the others. Grok is worse than all of them. Though, just as a total aside, if you want to have fun, you can tell Grok, enter asshole mode, and it will become extremely abusive and crazy. It's fun. It's entertaining. It's not actually useful. But I found the same thing. The other thing I found is prompt engineering is a big part of getting these tools to work optimally. So I'll often say, deeply read the attached document and consider it and then I'll go on from there. And it does seem to actually get it to spend more cycles thinking through what you wrote. And then also, I also, when I'm looking for critique, I write it as dry as possible. Please review this as a possible publication of the sort thus and such in this magazine or in this journal, blah blah, and consider it as a professional, acquisition and copy editor or something try to put its role as tightly as you can, because the role actually is important. And when you're using it through the API, which I haven't done recently, but I spent a whole year building a Hollywood screenwriting program that used the API, we were able to distinguish between the system prompt and the user prompt. And you'd put all that framing stuff in the system prompt. And it really worked well. I know the new API has some different set of roles, but the same, but you could get approximately the same idea by thinking carefully about defining the role for the LLM before you tell it what to do. And it makes a big difference.
Yeah, perspective taking is a unsung superpower. So just as an example for my post-labor economics work, I say, take a look at this from the perspective of a, state legislator, or take a look at this from the perspective of a central banker. That cues up an entirely different set of concerns and questions and criticisms. That is where I think AI can really shine, is because not everyone has access to, a central banker or a state senator or, a venture capitalist on speed dial, but the AI can do a good enough job to say, okay, well, if I'm thinking about this from the perspective of, a board of directors or a CEO, these are the things that really stand out to me. And I think that that's actually one of the reasons that all the major consultancies, from McKinsey to Deloitte and others, are kind of having an existential panic, is because I've heard through internet rumors that they're worried about their future because AI can do what they can do, which is take a perspective and provide feedback and provide suggestions. Tell me what KPI to use, and away you go.
I got to tell you a funny story about that. I was doing a little pro bono consulting for a small company, which I do fairly regularly. And they're nice people, and they know their technical business. They don't know jack shit about direct response marketing or how to do the mathematics of the funnel or anything else. And I had at first reluctantly agreed to give them a little tutorial. And then when the deadline came up, I go, oh shit, do I really want to spend 8 hours, researching, writing this thing? I wonder what ChatGPT, I think it was probably at that point, 01 could do. And so I wrote about half an hour writing a maybe half a page detailed prompt, put it in deep research mode, and then said, and gave it the name of the company. And I also said, I want an example, do blah, 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 and then give a working example. And then I said specifically, a crafty example for people who know their business but don't know shit about direct response marketing. I don't know if I probably said shit. I may or may not have. But anyway, I pressed it. That said go, and like 20 minutes later, the thing came out so good that I made like 3 changes, slapped my name on it, and send it to them. And they just about fell out of their chair. Thought that I had spent days on this thing. And literally, it would have been days at McKinsey. And I at that moment, I said, oh, there's $1 billion opportunity here for anybody who wants to do it, which I called snuffies in a box. In the management consulting world, some of the more cynical people refer to the associates as snuffies, right? And the snuffies do the real work. The name partners go out to lunch. They do read the final reports, make a few changes, some comments, but they're high level, right? And you can now build yourself a management consulting company with 5 general partner level or partnership level people, maybe 3 or 4, or maybe 10 tech savvy AI consultants. And for most bullshit management consulting work, the LLMs were good enough a year ago, and no telling how good they are today. I would be very worried if I was them. Those guys have been hand job artists forever. I've never hired one. I've had them in pitching me countless times. I can't believe how expensive this shit is for nothing. Fuck you. Get out of here. Right? And I hire my own independent people. Well, I can't imagine anybody will be hiring them for anything less than the most deep stuff where there are few real great in-house experts are there. But for the usual meat and potatoes business consulting, try LLMs first. Absolutely.
Yeah. Every Fortune 500 CEO is using AI already. Politicians are using AI. Judges are using AI. Now, of course, there's some ethical risks that goes a little off scope. We can touch on that if you want, but certainly the landscape is changing as these tools are, one, getting better, and two, the uptake is, I don't know if it's accelerating, but certainly we're getting to a point of saturation, I think, is safe to say.
First, let's talk about the take-up. There's still, of course, the Gary Marcuses of the world that bitch and complain about every version of every model and all this stuff. But, I say, let's look at how quickly this thing has taken off. There's been no technical products taken off this fast, right? And people would not be continuing to use it at the levels they're using it if this wasn't doing something that they recognize as having value. So this is a hugely valuable set of tools. And in the masses, people are recognizing. No doubt they're making errors, and probably some of them are going into psychologically dangerous directions, people who decide to use it as a therapist or something, or as an AI girlfriend. But for people doing real work of any sort, it is a really value-added tool. I've mentioned this before in the podcast. Very first thing I did the day that ChatGPT got released in November 2022, I was resigning from a board of advisors that I was on. And I wanted to write a nice, friendly, leaving the door open for future collaboration letter of resignation. And so I wrote up just basically that and said, please write this letter. And it was perfect. I could send it. That was the first day of ChatGPT. And so, work of that sort, anyone who's not using these tools is just going to be left behind. And I think that's a really important thing for us to talk about a little bit, because there are people who are afraid of AIs or sort of repulsed in theory about, they just hate the whole idea. I find this fairly often in writers and people who work in media. They go, ooh, AI. And it is true. You can get shitty content from AI, but if you're not using it, you're going to be left behind.
Oh yeah. AI slop is a problem. That's what kids these days call it on the internet. It has lowered the threshold to produce output. And so you have people that, were never ever going to write a screenplay or a novel or a poem or code, and suddenly they feel enabled, they feel empowered, which is great. That's what technology is supposed to do for humanity. But, everyone and their brother had the same idea. There is definitely a kind of a souring, a bad rap that AI has, which, societies always have to negotiate how they're going to integrate a new technology into the social fabric. That is part and parcel with, being Homo sapiens. At the same time, to your point, since I got in technology, and you've been in technology longer than I have, it's been an adapt or die kind of area. The operating systems change, the hardware changes, the software that rides on all of that changes, and you keep learning. And that, for me, it's just kind of been a de facto assumption. But one thing that has dawned on me is that many other industries do not change at the pace that technology has continuously changed for decades. And I think that it can be kind of a little bit of a wake-up call, a little bucket of cold water for some people when they realize actually everything can change out from under you. That leads to status threats. So there's a psychological kind of revulsion. This is going to take away my specialness, so therefore it's bad, and I'm just going to stick my head in the sand. And there is also something to be said for expertise. Senior developers, typically speaking, it actually slows them down to use AI coding tools just because they already know their business super well. Really, what it does is it's a jetpack for junior developers. But that's also why entry-level jobs are drying up, particularly in the tech space. So the closer you look at it, the more you realize there is nuance. It's not unidimensional. It's not all good. It's not all bad. But the most exciting part of this is that it's one tool that can do everything. It's the ultimate Swiss Army knife. It can do coding. It can write copy. It can do research. It can help with medical science. It can do, I don't know, say not absolutely everything, but it can do a heck of a lot. And and also, like any general purpose technology, not only can it do a lot, its horizon of capacity is expanding on a daily or weekly or monthly basis, which means that, the further behind you get, the harder it is to catch up. Now, how long that takes remains to be seen.
Yeah, that's it is interesting. I talk to a lot of people who, in fact, the vast preponderance of normies that I know are now using ChatGPT occasionally, like as a replacement for Google, or they use Perplexity as a replacement for Google, or to clean up a little email complaining about something to their insurance company or something. But I would suggest most people haven't gone any, not even 1% down the road to the things that you and I have been talking about. And I heard a very interesting idea from a collaborator of mine on another product project, which is he predicts that there's a huge business in being able to generate an appropriate tooling infrastructure that's accessible to normies to do the kinds of things that you and I are doing. He had some cool name for it. I forgot what it is. My take on it was yes, but not yet quite. What's your take on that idea and its potential feasibility today?
I think that that's where most of the value add is all the affordances from the user interface, pre-building all the piping and plumbing. The problem is scale. Because when you have a general purpose tool like Claude with projects or NotebookLM or ChatGPT Pro, those tools change so quickly. And more often than not, and having been in the space for a while and tried building one of those startups, what happens more often than not is the technology will advance and it'll completely subsume your business model. It's kind of a crapshoot because you're not really sure what's coming. So for instance, every company building agents right now, they might have their lunch completely eaten when Meta and Google and Microsoft and OpenAI and everyone else releases their next generation of computer using agents. So it's like, great, you built a startup and you got through pre-seed funding and you maybe even got to Series A funding, but then your market just completely dries up. Best case scenario for a lot of those startups is you get acquired, right? You like Windsurf and Cursor, they were kind of the first movers. And so then they get hoovered up by some of the bigger players. But at least in one of those cases, a lot of the employees were kind of left out in the wind. So I will say, yeah, that's the yes, but. Yes, there is certainly opportunity, but it's quickly becoming a red ocean, as far as I can tell.
It's interesting because this is exactly what I did, this screenplay thing. Originally, I did it just as a hobby project, but various people insisted that we try to turn it into a business. Fortunately, I had the good sense to not accept a fairly large amount of seed round financing that was offered to us because I could see I built the thing on way too small a base. I built it in first half of 2023, basically. And I built it initially in the days when there was 4K input and output windows. And I realized 16K was coming, so I sort of built that in. But the reality is, by the time we were considering taking the money in early 2024, that was nuts, right? Much bigger windows were there and much bigger windows were coming. And so I realized that the thing had been built on too narrow of a base. And sure enough, today, when I want to do something in that category, I just use Cursor, actually. It's far more flexible than my tooling. All the stuff that I built in to allow me to orchestrate the AIs at various levels in the process of going from a basic idea to a book to a full write-up of all the scenes to dialogue, etc. You can do great in Cursor, and it's far better. And so the whole idea of doing it as a bespoke agent that orchestrated LLMs was just a bad one. And so there is that risk for sure out there. All right. Well, do you have any other final thoughts that you would like to give to people who are thinking about using these tools as aids in thinking and research and writing?
I think that tool mentality is the correct thing. Just like any tool, you can go further, faster with it. You can also hurt yourself with it epistemically or emotionally, as we alluded to with AI psychosis or getting lost in your own echo chamber. So the biggest thing is just grounding. Use it for fact checking. Fact check yourself. Sanity check. I do that often. I say, let me upload a document or upload an idea. Let me just do a sanity check. Am I making sense? What am I missing here? What would someone else think about this? And it can be a really, really powerful tool. And then I guess the last bit of advice is find the edges of what it can and cannot do. Many people just jump in assuming that it can't do things, which, okay, that's not necessarily a bad assumption because you can prove yourself wrong. Furthermore, don't jump in assuming that it can do everything. Like any highly flexible general purpose tool, you have to build your own mental model of what it can and cannot do and how to use it. And I think that's the key lesson that we've been kind of orbiting around, is what are the edges of this class of tools? And if your opinion is more than 6 months old, you're wrong. Because the entire industry has moved on. That's what I always tell people is, well, it can't do X yet. I'm like, just wait 6 months and something will have changed dramatically. So yeah, those are my last pearls of wisdom for you.
Yeah, all right. I would concur with that. And that's interesting, sort of type 1, type 2 errors, right? One is trying to do something it can't actually do. But I find myself, I have a friend who is a complete non-techie, but he's now building whole big apps and shit all by himself. He says, Jim, you don't realize what these things can do, right? Just take the first assumption that the LLM can do it and then see if it can't. And I say that's kind of, for many people, including me, very useful advice. So I want to thank David Shapiro for a very interesting and I believe important conversation about where are these LLM tools fit into our working toolkit today.
Excellent. Thank you for having me back.
All right. Audio production and editing by Andrew Blevins Productions. Music by Tom Muller at modernspacemusic.com.